Hello, welcome to Therapy, etc. Um, and I'm excited to be here and to have some insightful conversations about all the things that encompass mental health. So, today I have a very special guest. She is a personal friend of mine, but also somebody that is in the field of mental health. And just a disclaimer, this is not going to be a podcast that is going to be just for mental health therapists or for people that are in the field. But it just so happens to be that some of my really great friends and colleagues are clinicians, are in the field of mental health. And this special person that I'm going to introduce in a second, she too is in the field of mental health. Um, but she has some really great knowledge and experience on things that I think is really relevant. So today we're going to be talking about cultural differences, specifically within the Latinx community. This is a very interesting topic, and our guest will discuss this a little bit further, but her name is Cyndi Alfaro. She is a licensed clinical social worker. She mentions that she's muy orgullosa de sus raíces salvadoreñas. She grew up all over the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, California, and recently relocated to be with her Colombian husband in Dallas, Texas. She's been dubbed an empath and a sensitive person, and her own therapist told her there's people who go into social work, and then there's people who are born social workers. And she is definitely born a social worker. So here she is. I will go ahead and let her in so we can have some conversation surrounding this topic. So hold on. Hello.
Hi, how are
Welcome.
you? I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes, so I just did a brief introduction on who you are. And so if you want to share anything additional, I will just kind of like let you introduce who you are and why we're here.
Okay, so hola, buenas tardes. Hi, everyone. My name is Cyndi Alfaro Gallego, and I am a licensed clinical social worker. And I recently relocated to Dallas, Texas. Obviously,
Mhm.
I never forget where I came from. I'm from Los Angeles County, and it's definitely been exciting to, for people who are familiar or who are in the LA region. LA is just like a hub of culture and diversity. When I was growing up in the early 90s, I'm Salvadorian. So it was interesting growing up with all these different cultures surrounding me. And now that I'm here in Dallas, it's also nice to see like the emerging like diversity that we have. And my
Mhm.
husband's actually Colombian. So it's just been nice, as a Latina to see so many different types of people in the cities that I've been fortunate to live in. So,
Awesome. Thank you for being here.
yeah, thank
I'm
you for
really
having
excited
me. Me
to,
too. I'm
to for
happy
you
to
to
be
be
here.
here. Okay, so you mentioned Texas, and I'm like, all I think about is cowboys, and I'm thinking like,
Rodeos.
yeah. Well, so tell me about how the differences that you notice between being in LA, where it's super diverse, and you've also lived in, or you've been in a few different places.
Yeah. My family
But
actually lives in New Jersey. They've lived there for the past 23 years. So have a little bit of
wow,
experience with how the culture there is too, a little bit. Yeah.
yeah. So New Jersey, LA, which is very diverse. You also lived in different parts of California, and then now that you're in Texas. So at least, from California and Texas, do you notice a lot of like cultural differences? Do you feel like you can't connect? Or do you find it relatively easy?
So I definitely think that obviously I had never been to Texas prior to coming over, meeting my husband and that experience. So I had my own perception of what Texas was going to be like. And, I'm going to be very transparent. I think a lot of my perception of what I imagined Texas to be like, it was
Mm-hmm.
ignorant because I
Mm,
hear Texas and I get, ooh, Texas, like red state, Republican.
yeah. Oh,
Like,
that's another piece. Yep.
I almost felt like I, you know, kind of scared. Like, am I going to be liked there? Are they going to want me there?
Mhm.
And this was prior to even meeting my husband. I always assumed that Texas, I knew there was people who were Mexican who lived here because it's so, it's right next to the border. But I also I wasn't sure like what to expect. But then when I came,
And also because you're Salvadorian, so it's, while there could be Mexicans there, like, it's more like even more different for you because it's not even your culture that is
Mhm.
there. You know what I mean?
So I think when I was growing up, I'm gonna be honest, I moved a lot. My dad was a truck driver. So he would be driving all over the country. And so wherever he kind of liked, we would kind of plant roots. So it's kind of interesting because I went to 13 different schools. And so I
Oh,
moved all throughout
wow.
Southern California. And I even lived in Seattle and like a suburb of Washington for a little bit when I was in elementary. So
Oh,
I
wow. I
got
didn't know
to
that.
experience a lot of, not only being Latina, but then being Salvadorian. So for me, I never felt like I could connect completely with my friends because a lot of the words that we use wouldn't translate, right? Or sometimes they would
Mhm.
tell me, "Oh, you're an adopted Mexican." And now looking
Huh.
back, I know that meant that with the best intentions and they meant to say like you're included and we love you. But at the time I didn't realize how much that really shunned my own culture and my own
Yeah.
identity. So it wasn't until I went to UC Santa Barbara that I was able to connect and meet other people who were from El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras and Central America and South
Mhm.
America. And it just like changed my life completely because I finally felt like I belonged. And even just like something so simple, like a boy in seventh grade who probably had a crush on me, he would bully me. He's like, "Oh, your cheese smells funny," and Salvadorians they smell funny because their cheese is weird. And like at the time, you're so like
Yeah, like, what does that
innocent,
even
you're like,
mean?
yeah, and I would and, people tell me now, and I think it's something that I'm aware of, but it happens unconsciously, that I change my accent when I speak Spanish, depending on who I'm talking to. So, my mom the other day was like, ya sonas como que si fueras de Colombia." And I'm like, "No, no," I'm like, "Soy
Oh.
salvadoreña." And people are like, "No, pero tú suenas más colombiana que salvadoreña." And then when I'm with my Mexican friends, people think like, "Oh, eres mexicana," because I like Mexican music. Like I love right now
Yeah.
Grupo Firme and trap corridos and
Oh,
like
there you go.
I love all that
Speaking my
music.
language.
Yes, I love Mexican culture. I love Mexican food. Some of my closest friends are obviously Mexican, and I love the culture. I love the people. And so that's been a blessing coming to Dallas. There's a lot of Mexican culture here. And surprisingly, there's a lot of Salvadorian culture here too. And I
Oh,
identify
okay.
that there's Salvadorian culture if there's a Salvadorian place to eat. So I'm like, if the
Uh-huh.
city has Salvadorian restaurants, then there must be enough of a demand for them to open restaurants. And there's at
True.
least 4 in Dallas. So that's been a blessing.
Ah.
And in
And
Dallas,
we connect through food and through,
mhm,
like, so, finding these restaurants, you'll probably find some people that maybe even from like your home city, or you know what I mean, like have some resemblances here and there.
yeah. And so that's been really nice for me. And like I said, my husband is Colombian. He was born and raised in Colombia.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of Colombian people in Dallas. So it's been nice to see that part of Latino culture and kind of get integrated with that because I didn't have that in Southern California. It was pretty much just Mexican. And I know that
Hmm.
we have Pico Union, but the schools that I attended to in the San Fernando Valley, for whatever reason, I wasn't exposed to that because I wasn't in that environment. So all
Hmm.
of my life, it was just like being a Salvadorian within like a predominantly Mexican culture. And so, unfortunately, what I encountered is like, so you imagine like being Latina and being
Hmm.
Mexican and the struggles you've had to face and the barriers. I almost
Right.
felt like within being Salvadorian in a Latina culture, it was like double the struggle because now I'm like competing. It felt like maybe when I was younger, I was competing, or maybe competing isn't the word I'm looking for, but it felt very much like, okay, well, there is like a cult, there is an embracement of Mexican culture
Mhm.
now, and there's Mexican representatives, and there's a lot of Mexican representation, but what about like the Salvadorian culture? And so I
Right.
almost felt like most of the discrimination and the racism that I encountered, unfortunately, was by Mexican people,
Mhm.
because they would just say things like, "Oh, you guys talk funny, and you guys are so like the stereotypes of I'm sorry, of Salvadorian women, like,
Mhm.
oh, Salvadorian women are promiscuous, and Salvadorian women are very ignorant, and they don't speak well," and just these really nasty,
Wow.
hurtful comments that people would say when I would introduce myself, and they would automatically assume that I was Mexican. So that already was offensive because they would
Right.
just not even try to get to know me as a person. And
Mhm.
they would be like, "Oh, you're not Mexican? I'm sorry." So that was
Huh.
another, you
Wow. So
know,
even like kind of bringing you down and then doing it again.
and then doing it again. And then on top of that, like adding insult to injury, like, "Oh, I've heard that Mexican women, and Mexican women this." I mean, Salvador, I keep saying Mexican because I love Mexicans, but I'm Salvadorian. So they would keep saying things like, "I've heard Salvadorian women are very feisty. And I've heard Salvadorian women are hoes. And I've heard Salvadorian
Oh,
women are this." And just
yeah.
very blunt and forward, and like completely not what my experience was. And so it's taken a lot of education and having to talk to people and explain, like, well, there's a little bit of everything in every culture. And while yes, there might be people that you will label in that way in El Salvador, or who identify as Salvadorian American because I was born in the United States,
Mhm.
um, there's also people like that in Mexico that you would probably label that way, or in other parts of Latin
In
America.
any culture, in any part of the world, there's always something to say
And
about
and
anybody,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and something I also want to point out is, like, my husband being from Colombia, something that I've experienced along his side is when he says like, "Oh, soy de Colombia," people will automatically be like, "Oh, Pablo Escobar," or like,
Oh,
and that is like very offensive because it's like there
yeah.
is so much more to Colombia than just Pablo Escobar, you know?
Or Shakira, though, also,
Or Shakira. And I
right?
understand where people wanna relate because, or that's also really, now that I'm older, it's kind of, it depends who's saying it. It can be a little endearing because, like you said, we connect through food, but I really don't like when people are like, "Oh, pupusas." I'm like, there is so much more to, like, they ask me the first, and then that's another thing, like, "Do you know how to cook pupusas?" And it's like, well, nobody's asking you, "Do you know how to cook tamales?" Like, why would you ask me that, Like, I feel like people are not ill-intentioned when they make those kinds of questions, right? Or when they meet my husband and they automatically want to talk about like the narco culture in, Colombia. But it's like there
Mhm.
is so much more to these countries and to the people that live in these countries. El Salvador is extremely small, right? And I only have my experience of what I know based on what my husband shared with me. But he's just one person in a country of like millions of people and
Mhm.
different cities, and it's almost like I try to explain to people Mexico is like huge. And so you have people who are from Baja, from El DF, from Oaxaca, from
Uh-huh.
from from Michoacan, Zacatecas. I'm shouting
Mhm.
out where all my friends are from Durango. Um, but their different regions have different foods, even different
Yep.
like ways of talking. So I explain to people it's very similar, like for other regions of Latin America. We have so much diversity within just like our own country. But now that I'm older, I have seen a lot more representation of Salvadorians. And it was ironic because it all happened once I was in college. So that's been a blessing, I think. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Like as you're sharing about just like in your upbringing, how all of the different like messages that you were told or things that you were said, how did you, and probably like at the time, um, you were probably just rolling with the punches, and I kind of want to know more about that. But now, as you reflect on that, like, how do you even like? Do you remember how you took care of yourself when you were a kid, or was it just like this is just another thing? Because I think at the time, at least for me, like I didn't know the language to use, right? To
Mhm.
I need this or I need that. Um, and like our experiences are different because I am Mexican, a Mexican American, first generation, and everybody around me was Mexican descent as well. And so I think similar to you, it wasn't until I was in college that I was really immersed in different cultures. Um, Funny enough, my sister, we have different dads, and so her dad is Salvadorian. But even then, even though like I did grow up with that piece of culture for a short period of time, um, it wasn't to the extent as when I was in college and meeting people and really understanding more about myself and more about others. And so I don't know how, like, I'm curious to know how it was to like be in these spaces as an 8, 9, 10 year old, as a teenager, and like feeling like almost like an outsider in many ways is what you're sharing, and still trying to find ways to connect. Like, how did you manage that?
So I think that, now reflecting back on my childhood, I was an only child for 9 years. So interestingly enough, my cousins were either like 3 or 4 years older or 3 or 4 years younger. So I couldn't
Mhm.
really connect to them, outside of school because they were older and they didn't want to hang out with me, or too little. And I was like, no, I'm too cool for the little kids. So,
Mhm.
and then I was just by myself a lot with my mom and dad. So I think for sure, two things. It caused me to kind of grow up a little faster than I think I would have liked. And I really found myself immersing myself in books and journaling. So, which
Mhm.
been my saving grace to this day. So I love to journal, and I would just
Mhm.
write because I felt like I could say how I felt in my journals, and I would just express like everything that I would be feeling. Like I would, I mean, I was pulling them out the other day, and I was reading things like, you know, um, Javier, if you're out there, I'm sorry, I won't say your last name, but I remember his name was Javier, the boy with the cheese. And I still have like, oh,
The boy with
Javier,
the cheese, I'm gonna
yeah, the boy
remember
with the
that.
cheese comment. Like I'm never gonna forget him, because that really marked me at the time because I felt like, oh, I didn't know that we were different because of our cheese. And I remember writing in my journal, and
Mm.
I read it the other day, like, oh, Javier made me feel really bad today. Like I'm not gonna tell people that I'm Salvadorian anymore. But at the same time, my mom raised me to be very proud of my heritage, and that's something I'm extremely thankful for. I remember and she was a little extreme, I think, because one time I was like, "Mami, quiero hacer folclórico," because all my friends were doing folclórico, and she's like, "No, mija." She's like, "Usted no es mexicana, usted es salvadoreña, y eso no es de la cultura de nosotros. So lo siento, pero no puede." And I'm
Mhm.
like, I don't know if as a parent, if now, I'm not a parent yet, but I think I would, if my kid wanted to do it, I would be like, yeah, cool. But I could see why, she was like, don't, because she wanted me to really embrace Salvadorian culture and be proud
Mhm.
of like where we were from and celebrate the things that we do. Um, and she would
Mhm.
always tell me, like, usted es del Salvador y nunca vaya a decir que es mexicana, porque no hay nada malo con ser mexicano, pero usted tiene que ser orgullosa de donde usted viene.
Mhm.
So that just means she would always tell me, like, don't ever deny your roots, like you're
Yeah,
Salvadorian.
be proud.
And there's nothing wrong with being of any other culture, but that you need to make sure you remember like where you came from and what your roots are.
Mhm.
And my dad's sister and her husband, they would educate me a lot about the culture in El Salvador and like about the Civil War and what caused our families to flee and come here. So I'm very thankful for them because they would give me books that they would read about Salvadoran authors, and that's what really
Mhm.
got me into reading. So I can't pinpoint what books they were now, but I just remember being around them and just having that education piece from them. and
Mhm.
that was really helpful to like me developing a sense of pride of like where I came from. And
Right,
we
at a
always
young
had like
age.
Salvadorian flags in our house. You know, we had
Mhm.
Salvadorian like ceramica or artwork or our families were very much about we're going to promote Salvadorian artists in our home. So my dad had like paintings from Salvadorian artists, we had sculptures, we had just so I really appreciate my parents for that because I think you walked into our house and you knew like, okay, these people are Salvadorian because they had like a big old
Loud and
poster
proud.
and it was like
Yes.
El Salvador, and it's like, okay, we know where you're from. So, and even now, that's definitely shaped my identity now because now in our home, I will have artifacts like my mother-in-law came a couple months ago and I asked her like, can you please bring what are they called? What you put on the refrigerator?
Like a magnet?
A magnet, there you go, I blanked out. So a magnet, and, she brought me a bunch of other little things that are reflective of, like, Colombia because I want our home to be inclusive of, like, both of our cultures. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
that's been pretty neat, just, like, um, coming in here, okay, there's a Salvadorian and a Colombian that live here. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
I appreciate that too.
So with that, like bringing in like the Colombian culture as well, do you notice big differences, like stuff, things that you do that maybe your husband doesn't do, or that he does that you don't do? Even like words that are completely different.
Definitely words. So, for example, we say pajilla to say straw in Spanish, and my husband says pitillo, So, in Mexico,
Huh.
somewhere, that might be like a vulgar term, right?
Yeah.
So, but for them, it's very ordinary, like very common, not ordinary, but just that's the word that they use for straw. They also say things like, and I'm not here to like talk about I'm just talking about my experience with my husband. This is not representative of every Colombian. Um, but for example, him and his sister, they'll say like "qué más pues" to say like "hi, how are you?" Whereas we'll
Oh, I've
say
never heard it like that. Okay.
they say "qué más pues." Um, for them, it's like "qué onda huevón," which is like for in my culture, that's like we don't greet each other by saying because for us, huevón means like lazy, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
I'm never
In
gonna
Mexican
say
culture
"what's up,
too.
lazy." Like
Yeah.
we don't use that term, but for them, it's more a term of like to say hi to a friend, and it's
Yeah.
different reasons, right? I think sometimes they'll use slang, and some people don't even will not use those terms. Um, and his sister and him don't use those terms interchangeably, but I think when he's talking to his friends or um, and it's just the culture. So those are very different. Those are just very like examples. And then, and I don't know if this is because I grew up in Southern California and I was surrounded by a lot of Mexican people, but I love hot sauce, right? And so my husband's like, yeah, we don't eat hot sauce like that in Colombia. Like we're more like, give me a little bit. But now that he's kind of living with me, I've noticed that he will ask for hot sauce. Like he'll try different hot sauces that I buy. So that's been kind of cool, like the merging of. Oh, and then they say frijoles, and we say frijoles, right?
Oh, even like the emphasis is on the I, I'm assuming,
Yes. So they
right?
say frijoles, and then they also like his name. I would say Jose Luis, but he doesn't like Jose, so he goes by no, he goes by Jose, not Jose. Has the accents on the
Um,
O. So even that was
mhm.
different because when I first met him, I was like, Jose. And he's like, Jose. And I'm like, Jose. And he's like, Jose. And I'm
You're
like,
like, say
oh,
my name right.
yeah. I'm like, and I want to be respectful of
Right.
making sure I'm enunciating his name the way it is. But so that was something different too. And their
Yeah, I mean,
accent is beautiful. They have a really like lovely, lovely accent.
and language plays such a role. I mean, like you were mentioning earlier, like if you are from one part of one country versus another part of a country versus from a completely different country, the accents are so different. Like I know like when I go to Mexico, like they'll sometimes they'll say things like gringa or pocha to me
Mhm.
when because I had like the blonde hair or whatever. But then when they actually pay attention to my Spanish, I do get a lot of people that will ask like, um, am I from like do I live in Mexico? And then they'll when I say no, I live in LA, they'll say things like, "How did you learn Spanish?" Or like, "Where did that even come from?" Because it's so uh it's traditionally, I'm assuming, people that grew up in LA, or I'm sorry, people that grew up outside of the native country can't speak the language in the same way. And so that's always something that's very surprising for people that I talk to. Um, and so even with what you were sharing about how um, the accents and when they come out, right? Because you notice it not only like you noticed it when you were living in California, but now even more so because in Texas, I'm assuming you're a minority in Texas again. I mean, in comparison, we're all minorities,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
even more so in Texas, you're
Yeah,
a
so I'm a
minority.
minority because El Salvador is super small, right? It's a tiny country. And even here, I feel like a minority because there's a big community of Colombians. They have their own Facebook group. It's called Colombianos in Dallas, and they have,
Oh, hey, join
there's
that.
a thriving Colombian community that outside of my husband and his immediate circle and family, I don't really
Mhm,
know too many, right? Because then the pandemic hit, so that's been another kind of barrier, I guess, to making more community here is,
mhm,
I started working remotely and I'm home pretty much most of the time. And
mhm.
so that really creates a barrier in trying to like connect with people, at least because I was used to connecting more physically. And so now I have to just get more creative, but
Mhm.
definitely would love to connect with more Salvadorian people. I
Mhm.
know that there is a big community of Salvadoreños in. Why did I sound? See, I sound even my accent sounded weird right there. Maybe because I got tongue tied. But there's a big community of Salvadoreños in Los Angeles,
Mhm.
and I follow a lot of people on Twitter. There's like this Instagram page. I think it's called Cipotes, and
Mhm.
I follow them on Instagram.
Mhm.
So it's nice to see representation.
Yep.
I am so excited for the day when I see a show on Netflix or a TV show specifically highlighting
Listen
Salvadorian.
up, Netflix.
I know,
It needs
like
to
I need a
happen.
show. I have a lot of ideas. It will sell.
Contact
I promise
Cyndi.
you. I know it will definitely sell. I promise. I have a lot of stories. But yeah, so I would just love that. I think one of my visions is just in some way, shape, or form collaborating to more representation for Salvadorians here. And
Mhm.
obviously, I'm Salvadorian American, so it's very different than someone who was born and raised in El Salvador. It's a
Right.
completely different experience because when I gone to visit, right away they know like she's from the U.S. I
Yeah.
stand out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a different experience being here in the United States. Um, and even those two are going to be completely different experiences.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, and I it's interesting you mentioned the being the minority because I went to my husband's his family had a family party and they were like, "Oh, you're one." Somebody said something like, "Oh, you're outnumbered. You're the only non-Colombian here." And I'm not gonna lie, it kind of made me feel like, "Oh, here we go again." In Los Angeles, I was the
Oh.
only not Mexican person, and now I'm the
Mhm.
only non-Colombian person, and so it definitely does bring back a lot of like, okay, people are very proud of their roots and their culture, and that's great. And I also want to be in spaces where I that's why I think it's made me very mindful when I'm in spaces when there's other people from other places. It's made me very aware of asking people like, where are you from, instead of just assuming like what
Yeah.
part of Mexico or what part of Dallas do you live in. I always just ask like, where are you from, and just I think those things have made me be very like it shaped my personality. It made me extremely social. It made me want to include everybody in things all the time. And I'm just
Now,
very
would it be different if somebody that was not from a Latinx culture were to tell you where you from? Would it, like, if it was somebody that was white, Black,
no,
Asian, would it make a difference for you?
I personally don't think so. Like I said, I think unfortunately a lot of the racism and the division that I've encountered has been from other Latinos.
Mm,
It's never so much been, I mean, of course, I've experienced racism from white people, and but I almost expect that. It's almost like I expect it from you because I'm brown and the color of my skin, right? Um,
mm,
but then when it's your own people who are putting you down because, and it's even happened with some of our acquaintances, I'll say acquaintances 'cause, that are maybe, that have put me because it's always it's one of those things where it's like you're not enough of this, right? So when I was in LA,
mhm,
it was like
mhm,
you're not Mexican enough. And then now it's
mm.
like you're not Colombian enough. And like they it's always like comparing, well, which one is the better culture to be? Because
Versus
you
just accepting who you are.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. And so
yeah.
I'm very fortunate that I married someone who's super inclusive. Like even in one of the posts, like my husband put our flags together and
Mhm,
I, in the beginning had some insecurities about like, is he like okay with marrying like a Salvadorian person? And I asked him and
mhm,
he's like, I feel really proud of who you are as a person and I'm extremely proud of like marrying you and like that you're
mhm,
Salvadorian.
mhm,
And so I think like that really like, oh, okay, because even
mhm.
that, like, um, you want to make sure you're like for me, it was very important when I was younger. I always felt like I would end up marrying a Latino just because not that there's anything wrong with not marrying a Latino, but I always felt
Yeah.
like I wanted to preserve the language and the culture. And now
Mhm,
that I'm a Colombian, it's so exciting because I'm like, okay, we're bringing in all this new like culture, new ways of speaking.
mhm,
Um, and so that makes me very, very happy. But I think now that you mentioned it, like, yeah, I wish like there was more education on just treating each other like human beings versus like, we're better because, we have a better accent
mhm.
or we're better because, Colombians are also very known for and not every single Colombian, right? But they are very hyper aware of their looks and like just being very
There's
in
certain stigmas that come with each culture, right?
this. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that that happens across the board, but I think they're just known for having like beautiful people and there is this idea that plastic surgery is really big over there. People are very hyper vigilant about like their weight, and I mean those are things that like kind of go across Latin American culture. I remember growing up, my mom was always like, "Te estás poniendo gorda, bájate," or
Oh, that's like a whole other conversation
yeah, that's a whole
on
nother,
weight, let me
yeah,
tell
so
you.
yeah, and I think, that also plays a big part in like,
Mhm. I'm like, I don't even wanna start on that one
yeah,
because
like that
that's gonna
we're
we're
gonna
gonna
have
be here a whole other hour.
yes, we need to do a whole nother podcast on just like that part of Latin
Yeah.
American culture. But so I think it's just been interesting to navigate, and like I said, my husband was born and raised in Colombia. So um our views are also like constantly, trying to like immerse themselves together because our experiences are just so different. Like just growing up in the United States, it's just like a completely different
Right.
situation.
Well, there's been a lot of fruitful things that you have shared here, but I am curious to know, like, any messages for people that are maybe in similar situations that are from one culture identity and they married another and even moved to another place like you did. Any advice that you have, any tips on how you can still kind of stay true to your own culture identity while living in a place where you are the minority again, so to speak?
I think it's very important for you to know that you're definitely not alone, even though you probably feel like, in that
Mm-hmm.
moment you are, that there are other people that are probably experiencing similar feelings and situations. And I think that it can be very overwhelming and even like a little bit scary to speak up in those spaces. But I think it is very important to stay true to yourself, stay true to your roots, and
Mm-hmm.
just educate people. And I know that that's uncomfortable sometimes because people
Mm-hmm.
have made, stereotypes of like, oh, well, to me, you guys are all the same. And I'm like, well, how would you feel if someone said that about like the people in your country and said that to you? Like,
Yeah.
because it would be something that would be very hurtful for you. So I always try to make it a point to like let people know, that made me uncomfortable, or, um, I'd appreciate it if you respected like my background or didn't kind of say
Mm-hmm.
those things. And that is super uncomfortable and it makes me super anxious. And I really dislike having those conversations. But then I think it helps the person kind of get more insight and awareness as to how their comments, or they're just being ignorant, and not by
Yeah.
trying to hurt you, but they just don't know. So it's helpful when you like have conversations and you educate people, because then it helps them be more aware of how the comments that they're saying can be really hurtful sometimes.
Right. Because the hope is that if they're saying these kinds of things, it's because they don't have the insight and awareness. And even though I can agree and disagree on the whole educating, like it's not my job to educate you, you should educate yourself.
Mm.
But at the same time, I will say that you don't know what you don't know. And so if I don't know about something, I'm going to ask, and
And I
so
remember, now that we're talking about this, one time someone made a comment, "Oh, like Baja Mexico is not Mexico," and it was in ill
oh,
intention,
do not even start with that one on me.
but it's
Everybody, I'm
kind.
from Baja California, and people be telling me that it is not the real Mexico, and that is very offensive to me because
Yes.
it is definitely the real Mexico.
Yes. So even making comments like that, and I always have to remind myself, like, if these are people who went to a university who are making these kinds of comments, what can I expect from people who are from other countries
Right.
who don't have the awareness that we had, who didn't have the information that we had? So I kind of also have to remind myself, don't take it personal. Um,
Mhm.
because it's exactly what you just said. People don't know what they don't know, but in
Yes.
those spaces, it is so important that we speak up and say something. Even just like, that made me uncomfortable, or that's not accurate. At least
And
for me,
maybe
that's how I've navigated it.
that's true, and, even just, like, before we wrap up for today, but even, like, on the receiving end, that if I were to say, well, actually, Baja California is part of Mexico. If you look at the little map, the peninsula on the left, that's where my family's from. And instead of the response to be like, that's not the real Mexico, that it could be like, oh, I didn't know.
Mhm.
That makes a big difference versus me having to feel like I have to justify my cultural background and my roots and where my family's from.
Yeah.
So that's the other piece also, that the receiving end is also open to like to not knowing and to asking questions, but also like check your words. We all have to check our words. We have to be,
Yeah.
checking ourselves constantly. So I hope that other people, like check your words
Yeah. And I always
because it makes
tell
a difference.
people,
Words matter.
yeah, the golden rule. I live by the golden rule as much as I can. Obviously, I'm human, but treat other people the way you want to be treated. And if you don't want
Mm.
people telling you, I don't like your music, I don't like your cheese, your clothes is nasty, like you're not gonna want to hear
Yeah.
those things. Don't
Yep.
say those things to somebody else.
Yep.
So that's
Yep.
probably my best advice, is just treat and talk to people the way you want to be treated and talked to. So
Yep. Yep. I agree. Cindy, thank you so much for being here
Thank you,
today.
Patty. It was my
Yes.
pleasure. I
Yeah,
can't
it
wait
was,
to do this again.
yeah, seriously. Now I'm like thinking we have all these things to talk about, even more. But I
Yes.
so appreciate you and everybody listening. I really hope that you heard or you resonated with this. Cindy is an amazing colleague and friend. So I thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank
And
you.
if you have any feedback or any questions that you have for Cindy or I, please reach out, send us a message. You can also follow the podcast at therapy.etc. the podcast on Instagram, and I look forward to more episodes on conversations like this. So thank you again,
Yes.
and
Thank you,
thank
Patty.
yes, thank
This
you,
was
and
so
thank
much
you everybody
fun.
for listening. Have a
Thank you,
great rest of
everyone.
your day. Bye.
Bye.